I have had the rather surreal experience this afternoon of going to a couple of sessions. This program was clearly designed for my benefit this afternoon, one on polling and one on elections, in both of which, of course, the most important contribution were a couple of slides which they said it was quite clear that the exit poll was by far and away the most accurate forecast of the 2017 election. So thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be giving this talk. I, like lots of people, since 2016, are having their lives dominated by Brexit. I'm being funded by the Economic and Social Research Council to study public attitudes as they evolved during the course of the Brexit process. I put up there for those of you the website the Twitter feed you should be following as opposed to the one that David mentioned, and the website that it relates to. So if you're interested in public attitudes towards Brexit, there's a lot more information there. And part of what I'm going to talk about this evening is work that we actually published yesterday. I'm also, however, going to talk a little bit about some further work based on the survey that was released yesterday that I didn't talk about yesterday, which, as it were, is work in progress. But I will also refer to some of the other polling evidence as well. Okay, let's see if we can, right. Okay, I'm basically going to address a couple of questions. A couple of questions that I suspect are ones that perhaps are particularly important for many people in this room who I suspect, I've probably here got disproportionately an audience for whom the facts, quote unquote, whatever they may be, is something that you think is particularly important and something that people should take into account. So the first question I want to ask is, have voters responded to the information, the new information, whatever it is, that's emerged since June of 2016? Or is it the case, as many people have suggested, that all they're simply doing is interpreting whatever they hear, whatever is said, whatever transpires, in line with their existing preferences, thereby certainly leaving support for Remain and Leave largely undisturbed, and maybe also, their views about what they want out of Brexit or anything else largely unchanged? Have we, in effect, got two camps who are so loyal to their perspective that they're not willing to shift? Now, you might want to ask, well, why am I bothering to ask this question? Well, in part, I'm kind of guessing that many of you in this room feel that whatever is your view about it, that Brexit's an important issue, and kind of you might enjoy at the end of a conference at least a half an hour vaguely interesting talk about where the public stand, and that's all you're interested in. That's fine by me. But I thought I should give it a bit of academic dressing. And I think, being slightly more serious, there are some interesting questions that Brexit raises that is relevant to both a literature of political science and also to our understanding of how liberal democracy operates. One of the things that my own community of political scientists have been constantly writing about ever since the 1960s is what we call partisan de-alignment, which is essentially the idea that fewer and fewer people have a sense of affective attachment or identity with a political party. So very few people out there now just say, I'm Labour, I'm Conservative. And some concern has been expressed about this. Is the reason why people are less likely to turn out and vote because they're less clearly committed to the parties? One of the things that we also tended to say about the advantage of people having a sense of loyalty to parties was that if they have a loyalty to Labour or Conservative or whatever, they then learnt the rules of the democratic game, and they also accepted the rules of the game that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. On the other hand, it was also always true that the literature said, but there are downsides to having a community of voters with strong emotional loyalties. One is that rather than thinking for themselves, they simply follow whatever their political leaders that they support and associate with actually believe. And that certainly, and this takes us back particularly to the debate about the Brexit process, is that they're just desperate to avoid cognitive dissonance. So if information comes along that is at variance with their view of the world, they either ignore it or they reinterpret it in such a way that is consistent with their views about the world. And so on the one hand, we were concerned about the fact that identity appeared to weaken, and maybe this was undermining democracy. On the other hand, there was some celebration of apparently an electorate that was more likely to think for itself, less likely to follow parties, and to that extent at least maybe somewhat closer to the Athenian model. So there's important issues here about what is the role of identity in a liberal democracy. Of course, this issue of cognitive dissonance also raises, what's now become, the famous thing about fake news. Well, perhaps fakeness is in the eye of the beholder, or of course, perhaps more seriously, fake news is indeed the manufacture of facts that are clearly not facts that happen to support the position of one side or another. I've kind of a little bit of that in the last 24 hours. Those media organizations that are strongly pro-Remain more or less deliberately misinterpreted some polling data I put out, because by so doing so, they could give the impression that there's been an enormous swing to Remain. If anybody, by the way, thinks that the attempts to avoid cognitive dissonance and partisanship is just about the Leave side, I'm going to disavow you of that preconception. The other thing of course, we can ask is, well, are referendums a good idea? This, after all, is the second referendum in a relatively short space of time where we've asked voters a pretty existential question, which is, who do you think should be governing you? Who should be making the rules? One was the Scottish independence referendum. The one was the Brexit referendum. Now, ideally, with referendums, we have a debate, we consult the people, and the people give a clear verdict. But, of course, this was a referendum in which the outcome was relatively narrow, and where some people feel that it wasn't sufficiently clear what Leave might mean. There certainly wasn't any prospectus. And that therefore, clearly, if the public have or haven't changed their minds, is perhaps now pretty important to understanding whether or not, at the end of the day, Brexit is or is not going to deliver the will of the people. And indeed also, to what extent are referendums mechanisms that create some of the partisanship that now perhaps exists amongst our public. So that's the kind of more academic end of what I want to do. Evidence, just a very little bit about evidence. I'm going to be primarily, though not wholly, using 5 surveys that I did using the NatSen random probability mixed mode panel. It's British social attitudes respondents who were originally selected at random, who then are interviewed either by phone or over the internet over a month's fieldwork period. If you want a shorthand, it's trying to get the best of both traditional high-quality random sampling and YouGov into one model. Now, you may feel that is a bit of something that kind of isn't possible, but that's what we're trying to do. Get the advantages of both approaches. Those are the dates. You can see there the number of people interviewed, and also the proportion of those people who were invited to take part in the survey who actually took part. Using this approach, the data are weighted according to standard demographics. But of course, because these are all people who are first of all interviewed for British social attitudes, which is an hour-long interview plus a 20-minute self-completion, there is lots of data about the distribution of the original population on things well beyond demographics by which the data can be weighted, such as, for example, interest in politics, which of course undoubtedly is one of the things that's associated with attrition. Okay, so much for what am I doing, why am I doing it, and what am I doing it with? What about some substance? Well, the first reason why indeed we might well think that partisan lens and partisanship is important is to be found in this slide. This is some work that was inspired by work that Sarah Holbert and her colleagues did, where they said, hang on, actually, maybe we've now got a public out there that may not say that I'm Conservative or Labour, but perhaps they say I am a Remainer or a Leaver. Now, without getting into the details, I had a few quibbles, like all survey questionnaire people do, about the wording of their questions. So I've reworded the question so that it's much closer to the same question that we used and have been using for years to ascertain partisan identification. And in particular, I have exactly the same question in the follow-up question, which is how strong a conservative or Remainer, etc., do you think you are? And I'm comparing for you the level of proportion of people who have a strong identity or a weak identity, for a partisan identity in the NatSen panel. That's the blue bars. And I'm comparing it with the proportion of people who say they are a very strong Remainer or Leaver, etc. And yes, you've got it. As you can see from the blue bars, there are far more people who say they either don't have a very strong party identity or indeed they don't have one at all. But in converse, what is it? About 3/4 of people say I am either a very strong or a fairly strong Remainer or Leaver. So it seems pretty clear that we are, as a society, now a society with a very clear sense of effective identity. It's about Remain and Leave, and that's displaced, or rather, it replaces something that already disappeared, which is a strong sense of partisan identity. So crucial headline number 1, Sarah Hobart is right, and therefore 2, this question of the partisan lens, is it therefore because people have a strong sense of identity that they are therefore looking at what's been going on through tinted glasses is clearly an important question. Second reason for a kind of a piece of evidence in saying that this seems to be an important issue, this is data from BMG, which they asked people how did they vote last time, would they vote another referendum now, and I'm putting up simply to show you that in their data, on average in recent months, 89% of Remain voters have said they vote the same way, and 89% of Leave voters have said they vote the same way. And that clearly there's a very high level of people not changing their minds about the principle of remaining and leaving, and in this data at least, apparently no difference between Remain and Leave voters. So again, it would seem pretty obvious that these are important questions to address. So, have attitudes shifted at all? I'm looking first of all at what people want out of Brexit, and then I'm going to look at how they think Brexit is doing. So, first of all, here's an issue on which there is a consensus, there always has been a consensus, and there is still a consensus after 2 years of the Brexit process. And that is whether or not we have free trade with the European Union. I won't go into the question wording, it doesn't use words like single market or any of that stuff, it's all in plain English. But note, ask people, should we allow European Union companies to trade freely here in return for us being able to trade freely there? It's still the case that 86% of people say yes. The number has not really shifted. And in truth, there isn't an argument about free trade, at least so far as the British public is concerned. Quite happy to have it. Of course, a somewhat tougher issue is whether or not we are willing to secure access for the single market by also conforming to one of the other of the 4 freedoms, which is freedom of movement, which of course was a central issue in the campaign. The blue line here are those people who would prioritize staying in the single market, according to Opinium. The green line, those who say they would end free movement. There's been a bit of movement, but as you can see, certainly since over the last 12 months or so, you know, even if you kind of do get your eyeball straight line out there, you're basically looking at a couple of parallel lines. Not obvious dramatic movement. Rather more volatility, and another question that ORB have been asking about whether immigration control is more important than free trade. It's an agree-disagree format. The blue line are those people who agree, so they are the immigration control folks. The green line, the disagrees. Maybe finally a bit of shift right at the end, post-checkers. Lots of bouncing up and down, what my colleague Anthony Heath would call trendless fluctuation, but very little in the way of a line with any obvious slope or gradient. However, it's not true that we've not changed our attitudes at all. Here we come to the issue of immigration, and this is a question about whether or not EU migrants should have to apply to come to the UK in exactly the same ways as non-EU migrants have to. In other words, you know, we end freedom of movement and we just treat EU migrants like everybody else. Now, before anybody runs away with the impression that the UK public have rediscovered their liberal bleeding heart on migration, Let me just remind you that the figure at the right-hand side is still 59%. A majority of people are still in favour. That said, as you can see, 18 months, 2 years ago, the figure was much more like 3/4. And this is not the only survey evidence out there which suggests that actually during the course of the Brexit process, the concern about immigration and the wish to control immigration has to some degree at least reduced. What about, however, the other crucial issue in the referendum campaign, particularly for those who are arguing for Remain, which are the anticipated consequences of Brexit for the economy? So again, this is going back to the NatSen random probability data. Now, back in at the time of the referendum, even then, there were more people who thought that we would be worse off as a result of leaving the EU than thought we'd be better off. That was always true. It's just that nobody spotted that persuading 40% of the people that you'd be worse off as a result of leaving the EU is less than 50%, and you need 50% to win a referendum. Referendums are much more difficult to win than general elections. But subsequently, just some evidence, not dramatic, that maybe we've become a bit more pessimistic about the economic consequences of Brexit. It's a modest change rather than a dramatic one. But certainly, despite that strong partisanship, apparently still some willingness to change minds. And again, if we look at a similar time series from YouGov, here at the blue line are those people who agree that Britain will be economically better off. The green line, those who disagree. And the green line has gone up a bit and the blue line has gone down a bit. So again, the sources all seem to agree that's just been a bit of a movement. But not all the movements have just been no more than modest. Here, for example, is what happens when the public are asked, do you think the UK is going to get a good or a bad deal out of Brexit? Doubtless you will be aware that every time somebody raises a question about what the UK government will or will not achieve, the standard response from every UK spokesman is that we are confident that we will get a good deal and we're working hard every day to achieve it. Well, as you can see, the more that statement has been repeated, the less that it has been believed. So that whereas back in February of last year, almost as many people thought we would get a good deal as thought that we would get a bad deal, now only as many as 57% of us think we're going to a bad deal, and only 70% of us think we're going to get a good deal. Indeed, my last round of data came out of the field literally about 2 days after the Chequers agreement, just in case wondering whether Chequers has made any difference. Yes, it has. It's reinforced our impression that, in fact, the government is going to struggle to get a right deal. This is, again, polling data. I think this is from ORB again. The green line are those people who don't think the Prime Minister is going to get a right deal. The last couple of readings are post-Chequers. So, if anything, probably that 57% figure in my data is now too low. So, against that very clear change, you might be saying, well, hang on, did he show earlier that apparently not many people have changed their minds about the principle of Brexit? Well, a couple of other things that we have to take on board, however, in order to understand this puzzle. The first is to ask people, well, how well do you think the two sides are handling the negotiations? This is one that none of the commercial pollsters has been following, but fortunately I thought of the idea about 18 months ago. So just asking people, how well do you think the EU is handling the negotiations? Now, we're, unsurprisingly, we're pretty skeptical about Michel Barnier and his crew even from the beginning, but we've become more critical of the way in which the European Union has been handling the negotiations. That said, the reputation of the UK government has been shredded even more. In fact, I've missed off the most recent reading here, but again, it's still around just over the 60% mark. We are now deeply critical of the way in which the UK government is handling the Brexit negotiations. And again, just in case anybody is wondering whether Chequers has made any difference, yes, it has. The critical number has gone up even more, most recently in YouGov's data. So 2 things to bear in mind there. Yes, we are now deeply pessimistic about what Brexit will bring, but we're also minded to blame the politicians for what's happening. And I want you to hang on to that thought as we try to understand why attitudes have and haven't shifted. So, having looked at that, what I now want to look at is, well, how should we understand the stability, but also the turnover that does exist so far as our willingness to vote, remain, or leave, or concern is a gain. Now, so point one is, and also what I want to do here is to look to see whether or not there is any evidence that the support for either remain is softer than that for leave, or leave softer than that for remain. At the beginning, I suggested to you there was no difficult, but I'm now going to reinterrogate that question, so I'm going to do that, as well as looking more generally as well, what is it that does or doesn't shift the numbers in the polls. So, the first thing to note, again, I said I was going to disabuse you of the notion that conviction politics is the preserve of leave voters. This is the strength of identity broken down by whether you currently regard yourself as a Remainer or a Leaver. And yes, Remain voters are more likely to have a strong affective attachment to their view than are Leavers. And if you think that Remainers are sensible people who are using their brains in order to decide whether or not we should be in the EU, and they are the sensible people, and the Leavers are the emotional people who are simply concerned about sovereignty and rebelling against immigration, and they're not using their brains, I'm afraid you're wrong. A sense of affective attachment amongst Remainers is stronger than that amongst Leave voters. This is a story of polarization of identity between two sides, not a case of one side being polarized and the other lot supposedly being sensible. What about also, so given that apparently the strength of identity on the Leave side is somewhat weaker, insofar as partisanship may be holding people to their original choice, there's the first reason to believe that maybe it might be a little bit less of an anchor for the Leave side than for the Remain side. Let's also now re-examine the question of the extent to which there is turnover in people's vote choice. Because although BMG find virtually no change between Remain and Leave voters, other polls do find something of a difference. This is the data that I published yesterday, and according to our most recent wave, 90% of Remain voters, yes indeed, would vote Remain again, but the figure amongst Leave voters is somewhat lower. It's 81%. And this, in truth, is all something also you can see in YouGov's polls, many of which, so far as the question of whether you'd vote again, are, of course, being commissioned by the People's Vote campaign. They chose their polling organization wisely because they chose one which actually seems to be more likely to show a difference in terms of the loyalty of Remain and Leave voters than are some other polling companies. Now, I'm not saying that it's in any sense that YouGov's data are wrong. I think one possible explanation as to why they are different is that both us and YouGov were asking people how they voted in the EU referendum not long after the EU referendum, at worst in their most recent British Social Attitudes interview. We weren't just asking them again last summer. Some of the other polls have been asking people how they voted in June 2016 at the same time as they're asking them how they would vote now. And that obviously creates the risk of greater consistency. Still, whatever you think, on balance, there's somewhat more evidence that the Leave vote is rather more fragile. Does people's strength of identity make a difference to their probability of voting again? Well, unsurprisingly, it does, though the gradient is kind of rather sharper on the Leave side than the Remain side. Even amongst those Remain voters who say, I'm not a very strong Remainer, 95% of them still say they'd vote the same way again. It's only amongst those who say, well, not really, some of whom actually will have changed their sense of identity. Do we have a strong falling off? But not very strong Leave voters, the level of loyalty falls down to 2/3%. But clearly, that partisan lens is there. It will help to hold people to their sense of loyalty. But at the weaker end of the spectrum, particularly on the Leave side, it will begin no longer to do so. Okay, so let's go back to this question of why it is that we think we're going to get a bad deal, but apparently we haven't changed our minds a great deal, albeit perhaps slightly more on the Leave side than on the Remain side. Well, the first thing to note is that the change of mind about how good a deal that we're going to get isn't simply Remainers moaning on, all right? The increase in the proportion of people who think that we're going to get a bad deal, it's gone up on the Leave side from 20% to 40%. It's similar to the 16-point increase amongst the Remain voters. Now, Leave voters are still more likely to think we're going to get a good deal than Remain voters, but they are also much more pessimistic, and indeed more of them now are pessimistic than are optimistic about how good a deal that we would get. So it's not that Leave voters are so partisan that they're not willing to change their minds about how good a deal that we are going to get. And again, this is confirmed by YouGov, and again, particularly, just look at the right-hand side here. Here I'm effectively looking at pre- and post-checkers using similar data from YouGov. Yes, the Remainers were already kind of almost universal in their feeling that the Prime Minister was not going to get a very good deal, but notice how the increase is particularly sharp amongst Leave voters. Okay, however, one of the things, of course, everybody in this room will appreciate, but is occasionally somewhat difficult to get across to the media, is that because people have changed their minds about something that you think ought to be related to the way in which they would vote in another referendum, it doesn't mean that it is necessarily related. Because, of course, what is crucial is the relationship between whatever variable on which attitudes has changed and people's propensity to vote the same way again. It's always a difficult job to get the media to think about relationships, and I inevitably had a bit of a struggle yesterday, but hopefully some of them got the message. Now, underlying this, by the way, for those of you who are much more statistically minded, is a fair amount of logistic regression. I'm just showing you, as it were, what the logistic regression tells you in a rather more palatable form at 5:30 in the afternoon. So, crucial point to note. Let's just take, for example, the Leave voters. So the Leave voters are the ones in orange. And what I'm doing now is breaking down the probability of voting Leave again, according to people's reports, by whether or not they think we will get a good deal or a bad deal. And it's true, it is true that if you think we're going to get a bad deal, you are somewhat less likely to say you would vote Leave again. But it's still 76% of Leave voters who think we're going to get a bad deal who would still vote again. And indeed, conversely, there aren't very many of them. Those small number of Remain voters who think we'll get a good deal have also now potentially changed their mind. So there's a relationship there, and you put it through the statistical source machine, it kind of comes out. But it comes out a fair way down the pecking order. Because, of course, what is potentially crucial is who do you blame. The Brexit process and whether or not we get a good or bad deal is something where you can say that's a failure of the politicians, particularly of the politicians I never really liked in the first place, and therefore it doesn't necessarily change your view about the merits of remaining or leaving. So, for example, as you can see, Leave voters, they are more likely, the 69% there, to blame the EU for the way the negotiations they feel are going pear-shaped than they are the UK government. In contrast, Remain voters are more likely to blame the UK government than the EU, not least because probably they think the UK government was daft to invoke Article 50 in the first place. So notice, therefore, that people are able to blame the institution with whom they didn't necessarily have much affinity in the first place, particularly on the Leave side. And again, this makes a difference. So notice, for example, that if you think, if you're on the Remain side and you think the UK government is screwing up, 93% chance that you're going to vote the same way again. If you don't blame the UK government, then there's a falling off in your loyalty. So for Remain voters, And in fact, I can just break this down further to those who think we're going to get a bad deal. If you're a Remain voter and you think we're going to get a bad deal and you blame the UK government, you're virtually 100% guaranteed to vote the same way again. Whereas Remain voters' views about the EU, not so important. For Leave voters, what matters is whether or not they blame the EU. If they blame the EU, this helps to insulate them against the perception that maybe we're going to get a bad deal. It's their fault. They're failing to deliver our instructions. We told you so. It was a rotten institution. They are not, therefore, necessarily changing minds. So this is the way in which the partisan lens helps to protect people from changing their minds, if that's the right way of thinking about it, so far as perceptions of a good or bad deal is concerned. But now let me look at something else on which the headline numbers that might attract journalistic interest have not moved anything like so much, but which actually prove to be rather more interesting and important. And these are the perceptions of the economic consequences of Brexit. Now, again, here I'm comparing for you the position of Remain and Leave voters on this in the autumn of 2016 and the most recent reading last summer. And basically, actually, it's not changed on the Remain side, basically because virtually everybody on the Remain side was already deeply pessimistic about the economic consequences. So although the shift in the increase in pessimism about the economic consequences of Brexit was modest in aggregate, it's actually concentrated or virtually wholly amongst those who were Leave voters, plus another group, the Abstainers, which I will come to in a moment. Now, it's still the case that Remain voters are predominantly still thinking we're going to do fine economically out of it, but notice there's nearly 1 in 5 of them who take the opposite view. And equally also here, whether or not your economic perceptions, these are clearly, again, potentially undergirded or otherwise by your strength of identity. Your stronger your sense of identity, and you Remain voter, the more likely it is you think we're going to be worse off. Equally, if you are a Leave voter, the stronger your sense of identity, the greater probably you're going to be better off. Although notice, even amongst those who are very strong Leave voters, only 71% of people think we're going to be better off. So that slight ambivalence about the economic benefits of Brexit is still even there amongst strong Leave voters. But this is the more crucial point, and this is what logistic regression tells you in more human terms. Now notice that whereas earlier I showed you that only 76% of those voters who thought we'd get a bad deal and who voted Leave would vote differently, when you look at those people who think that we'd be worse off economically, that figure is down to 48%. It also works on the other side of the fence. There aren't very many of them, but those Remain voters who now think, actually, Brexit's not going to be so bad after all, have also changed their minds. So when it comes to understanding why people are, insofar as people have shifted their attitudes, why they might do so, it's the question much more of what the economic consequence of Brexit would be, not actually, by the way, the issues about immigration, that seem to be crucial to understanding the flux. And in a sense, this shouldn't surprise us. We know from all the research that actually the economic consequences of Brexit, as they were anticipated, was the thing that's most clearly related to how people voted in 2016. It wasn't immigration. And again, we find that the flux, such as it is much more clearly related to how people's economic perceptions. And of course, the logic here makes sense. As I've already said, if you think we're going to get a bad deal, you can blame the politicians. But if you've come to the conclusion that Brexit itself is going to be economically bad, it becomes more difficult to insulate your prior perceptions or preconceptions against that perception. Now, that sense of loyalty, that sense of partisanship is still there underpinning it and reducing the extent to which people turn over, but the economic perceptions do appear to have some potential impact. Okay, before I conclude, however, there is one other community that I've not talked about, which the commentators have largely ignored, but which also is crucial to understanding why, in fact, the opinion polls, to some degree, now tend to show a small Remain lead. And that is those people who didn't vote in 2016. We should remember, according to the official statistics, 29% didn't vote, and they've been joined by those who were 16 and 17 back in June 2016. And what I'm showing you here for the whole of the time series that we have, we've been asking folk how they would vote again in another referendum all the way through the 5 series. And as you can see from the beginning, those who didn't vote in 2016 have been more likely to declare themselves Remain supporters than Leave supporters. And if anything, that gap has been wider, certainly during the course of the last year or so. And it's at least 2 to 1 of Remain to Leave amongst this group. And all the other polling out there, which actually gives you the relevant information, also shows the same thing. So in understanding what's going on, we shouldn't just be looking at so-called regret, i.e. whether Leave voters now regret their choice. We should also be looking at what I call abgret, which is perhaps the regret of those who never voted about not having done so. And again, just to confirm, this isn't just my data. This again is BMG's data. Remember, BMG don't show any difference in the loyalty rates of Remain and Leave voters, but boy, oh boy, don't they find a difference in the propensity of Remain and Leave voters to declare for Remain and Leave. It's even bigger than we've got, and this is wholly driving the shift towards Remain, which is there in BMG's polls. It's wholly, in their case, being shifted, moved by the views of those who did not vote. So we should look at this group. Are they, can we go on another one, please? The first thing, unsurprisingly, is that those who didn't vote are less likely to have a strong sense of identity than those who did. That's what all political science theory would suggest. But still notice that around 66% of them claim to have a strong sense of identity. So less engaged, but maybe not that disengaged by a conventional sense of views. Secondly, sorry, we've now gone on 2, right, back one, is that when you ask them what are their views about the economic consequences of Brexit, lo and behold, they are a pretty pessimistic group. And indeed, if you then look at how the abstainers would vote, and broken down by their perceptions of the economic consequences of Brexit, 70% of those abstainers who think we're better off would vote to leave, 70% of those who think we're worse off would vote for Remain. And this is also, amongst all the data that we are collecting, is the variable that above all is most clearly related to how abstainers say they would vote. So again, the question of the economy proves to be important. But it's this group that helps to explain why we have had, since last year's general election, and the general election is crucial, since then, on average, the opinion polls have tended to show Remain ahead. This is a little poll of polls I've constructed for you of all the polls of second referendum voting intention, which have become much more common more recently. Before the election, on average, they tended to show Leave ahead. Since the election, they have tended just show Remain ahead. Maybe it's eased out a bit more, although if I were to redo this now, it's probably 52.5 because Salvation only had 50% yesterday. It's also a similar pattern in the question that YouGov are asking, which is, in hindsight, do you think the Brexit decision was right or wrong? Before the election, a majority of people said it was right. Since the election, a majority of people have said it's wrong, and if anything, it's eased out slightly more since the Chequers deal. But in understanding those shifts, it isn't just regret, albeit there may relatively be some. It is also the result of abstainers having different views about the election. That said, and finally, before I come to a conclusion, do we want another referendum? Sorry, could we go forward one, please? On which I was being regaled by a senior cabinet minister last night. It definitely isn't going to happen. Anyway, we shall see. Now, you need to understand that the answers you get to the question of a second referendum depends on the wording, and I haven't got time to go into it now here. But these are the data that I would trust. These are the data that are based on the polls that actually ask people what they want a referendum about Remain versus Leave, as opposed, for example, without specifying it. Once you do that, yep, 68% of Remain voters would like another referendum, and 68% of Leave voters would not like another referendum. This is an issue upon which essentially it's a surrogate for how people voted last time, and so far at least it's not clear that the People's Vote campaign have been particularly successful in persuading Leave voters that it is a good idea. This at the moment is still a very deeply partisan campaign. Okay, to conclude. So, relatively few voters have changed their minds about the principle of Brexit, not least because it is indeed underpinned by a very strong sense of Remain and Leave identity. Identity politics is back after 30 years of political science writing saying that identity politics was dead. That's how much you should believe political scientists. But despite that, some attitudes towards what Brexit should contain and evaluations of the Brexit process have changed in some cases quite considerably. The voters aren't just looking at it through a partisan lens, although the partisan lens means that in many instances they can blame the politicians they never liked in the first place rather than themselves. But it's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton would say. When it comes to that, that is potentially capable of changing people's views. But bear in mind that the reason why the balance of support between Remain and Leave has tilted, it's also to do with the views of abstainers, not just those who voted to Remain. So, coming back to my big, grand academic questions. The first thing, perhaps, therefore, we should take away from this lesson is we've tended, amongst my community, to think that the process of partisan de-alignment is telling us something about voters, that voters have changed. Well, maybe, given that all of a sudden we've discovered that these very same voters are actually capable of developing very strong senses of affective identity vis-a-vis Remain and Leave, that maybe, in fact, it was always telling us much more about the political parties than about those to whom they were trying to appeal. And that, indeed, as we would expect, that strong sense of identity has created a strong sense of political engagement. BSA shows interest in politics being up. The referendum had a highest turnout in any general election since 1997. But of course, because this is a zero-sum contest, unlike a general election where you can go back and ask the voters every 5 years, that strong sense of partisan identity, unlike partisan identification, doesn't necessarily bring about agreement on rules of the game, not least, for example, on whether or not we should have a second referendum. It does, therefore, mean that people's negative evaluations of the process doesn't necessarily alter process, and that voters can avoid cognitive dissonance through how they assign credit and blame, and that fake news is in the eye of the beholder. So the downsides of identity politics are also with us. But we should remember there was always an upside and a downside to the decline of identity in the first place. But still, if those who did not vote have distinctive views, and the result of a referendum is close, then indeed referendums may well fail to answer the issue in question. And I think certainly so far as public opinion is concerned, Brexit is still open to question.